Welcome to the Followup podcast. My name is Hayden. I am the worship director here at Arbor Church, and today I am joined by Alison, our community care pastor, and Ryan Plants, our senior pastor and speaker from Sunday. All right, so we took a week off last week for Community Serve Day, which was a ton of fun. Saw quite a few of you guys out there at the different schools. And then we, this last Sunday, hopped right back into our series, Summer on the Mount. And we got to hear about retaliation, which was just super life-giving and a peaceful conversation.
We were going for a very easy, non-challenging teaching of Jesus that, it's just like, okay,
low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, I got that.
Yeah.
It's not a problem. Easy stuff.
Totally.
Right?
And it just, it was chill. No one had issues with it. People were like, I needed to hear this. So just all around kind of what you want on a Sunday, a non-challenging piece of scripture. But we are saying all of this in jest. It was, the content is pretty challenging, right? Whenever we talk about retaliation, anytime we talk about conflict, I think it was also very funny the first message was about peacemaking and then retaliation. And we've had two sermons in the past, 4 weeks on kind of centered around conflict, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I will ask, even though I think I know the answer, was it an intentional choice to have peacemaking and retaliation in this series?
Yeah, it was. Looking through the Sermon on the Mount, I looked through and tried to pull out the things that I thought would be most relevant for our culture. Still being so new to Arbor, and obviously knowing some of the story of our church, what would be most beneficial. But we all swim kind of in the same culture, and so the things that we wrestle with are very similar. And it was just stuff where it was like when you look at it and you're like, yeah, that's going to be something that like is really going to press us and challenge us. But also things that I think as a people we need to make sure we're pressing into to really embody, to be the body of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Alison, as a 9 on the Enneagram and our in-house peacemaker, were you sitting through this message just thinking, yeah, guys, just chill out. Like, it's not a big deal. You don't need to retaliate. And
well, what's funny is that for being a peacemaker and being somebody who loves harmony and unity and all of that, I felt challenged. There was a point in Ryan's message where he said, like, think of somebody that you currently have a conflict with, and let's like move through the message with that person in your mind. And it wasn't hard for me to come up with one, but
because it was me.
Because it was you, Hayden.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I do wonder for some other Enneagram types, if for them it's more like a list that they have. Like, I've got conflict in so many different arenas of my life. Like, I've got a couple at work, I got a couple at the grocery store, a couple in my neighborhood. Like, they probably are able to come up with a lot. And I wonder how like an Enneagram 8 would approach this message, in so many ways. I think that we'll get to it later. I think there is a part in your message where you did address sort of a what now for them, but we'll get to that later. But yeah, for me, I felt like for as much as I love the peacemaking life, this was a challenge even for me. So,
I'm curious for both of you. This is a question either of you feel free to answer on. I think the first week that we talked about this series on the podcast, I had talked about how this is kind of like it felt like a just stream of consciousness coming out of Jesus, right? Like there is some connectivity between the things that he says on the Sermon on the Mount, but it is also kind of like popcorn thoughts and like this is, let's talk about this for a few minutes.
Yeah.
How far apart are these sections between peacemaking, because that's the Beatitudes, right? Blessed is the peacemaker, and retaliation in the sermon?
Yeah, so peacemaking, it's really just it's one beatitude. one beatitude right at the beginning, and the beatitude is sort of like a boilerplate teaching section where Jesus kind of outlines, like, here is what someone who is a citizen of my kingdom looks like, and then he moves on from there and kind of digs into like the details. And so the retaliation section starts at verse 38, and peacemaking, I think, is verse 9.
Even in that same chapter?
They're both
5?
in chapter 5.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they're both in chapter
Okay.
5. And essentially what Jesus does, he does the Beatitudes, he does salt and light. There might be another section there. And then he actually has a little teaching there on the law. He sort of pivots, teaches on the law, and then he moves into sort of that formula of, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And so I think he talks about marriage, he talks about anger, and then he talks here
adultery,
about marriage and adultery are kind of right there together, and then he talks about retaliation.
Yeah. What I think is interesting is he brings up the Old Testament reference of an eye for an eye, and I think I'll speak for myself as a current reader of that scripture and hearing that on Sunday. Like initially, it feels like, oh yeah, of course we've moved so far away from that, but in truth, not really. Like I think we've talked about, we all kind of have a desire at some point in our lives for a pound of flesh when it comes to a conflict, or even if we boil things down to our basic, human younger self that's inside of us, is I want you to feel some semblance of the pain that I have felt. And that's kind of what leads some of our irrational decision making, right? When we're angry and we're in conflict. But I'm curious, when we look at what Jesus was teaching on the Sermon on the Mount and we bring that into our today, I guess, scope, right? Or our lens, if Jesus was teaching that today, what are some of the things that he would then reference, right? He's not necessarily going to reference eye for an eye, or you've seen this. And you talked in your sermon about the tunic and the cloak and the Roman soldier asking someone to go an extra mile. What would be the today's context of that? If Jesus was giving relevant examples like that, what would be an example of that in today's world for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Jesus is addressing is our deep need that we feel for fairness. And so, if your child insults my child, they have to be appropriately reprimanded for that thing. If you steal from me, you pay it back. If you say something behind my back, you correct that. Or, we go about it in a different way. If someone says something behind our back, we then tarnish that person's character. I mean, I guess if you wanted to be a thief and they stole from you, you would try to just steal it back from them. But I think at the heart of it is just this idea of fairness. And so essentially it would be whatever that would look like for us today in that context. Like, where do we encounter conflict in this world and want something to be fair? I don't know. Like, are there ever times where you're at the grocery store and your apples don't get rung up correctly, and that's perhaps that's a really small, insignificant, inconsequential way where you're looking at your receipt and you're like, what, those apples were supposed to be $1.99 a pound. And I mean, I don't know, are you going to go into the store and grab a few extra apples to really stick it to the man? Or
I kind of think some people do. I mean, in a way, they take justice into their own hands, and they justify their behavior, because the man or the system has screwed me, and so I'll screw them back.
Well, we talked about one example earlier, which I thought was quite funny. This idea of quiet quitting,
right?
That's going on in our culture today, and I've seen that on the internet recently. This idea that instead of outrightly quitting one's job, one just sort of slowly fades in the background and stops doing the work. And that's in essence your own. You are simply trying to take back your agency, or and what you're doing is that individual is still getting compensated,
right?
But you're not working at all,
right?
I also
it's your form of protest,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
against
against the unfairness or the injustice that you feel you're experiencing at the hands of your employer.
Right.
I also, on the grocery thing,
Yeah.
I heard that like, I don't know if it was like a tweet I saw or some article online that like for some people, it's just a given that they'll only scan like 80% of their groceries in the self-checkout line, which I thought was like, it really blew me away. I was like, what? Like, that's crazy. But perhaps that's another move toward like, well, groceries are getting more expensive, or, you know, like they always charge so much here anyway. Like I've earned this little bit because so much has been taken from me.
Yeah.
I mean, it even makes me think like, in what ways do we seek an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth?
Yeah.
In a transferred sort of way,
Right.
where we've received unfairness or injustice in this arena, and so now we're retaliating over here, but against a completely unrelated party.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think that goes to what's the word that you used? Oh, like the vicious cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes I feel like there's little things that we can do in our everyday life that could help fix that cycle or correct that cycle. But something that you had said of like, I'm not going to be able to fix society's issue just by doing this. Like I think about when I lived in an apartment, when I would take my trash out to the dumpster, like I would just grab like a handful of trash that people just decided, I didn't make it in the trash can, I'm just going to leave it there. And I know that like that action every couple days is not going to fix the trash issue at the apartment that I was living at. But it was like, if I can do just a little bit, will that help with that cycle? Maybe people will see like, oh, it's less dirty. Maybe we should take care of this thing. But then there is a certain futility of it, right? That if you start to look at it, you're like, I'm really not making a huge difference here. But should that negate the effort at all? That maybe I'm not seeing the difference that I'm making. I run into the retaliation and conflict everyday driving.
My mind was going to cars too for some reason.
Yeah,
I don't know why.
I see it especially when a lane is ending.
I was thinking of merging
No,
too.
Yeah,
the
and people-
zipping is important.
Well, and people will just fly up past like on the shoulder, and it's like, so you didn't want to be 2 cars back. You didn't want to fall in line earlier, or maybe you just weren't present. Maybe you were looking at your phone. You're in a new area, so you didn't know that the lane was ending. But that's one area where I'm like, man, I really hope
I think
they get what's coming to them, because they just shot past me on the shoulder. And the other spot too, and it's like my least favorite and favorite place, Costco, trying to find a parking spot, and then you're waiting with your turn signal, and then someone comes in from the other side and takes that parking spot, and you're like, I hope that you park and you can't open your door and you got to readjust. Or
well, and in that small instance, like what kind of interpersonal interaction are you going to have with them where you would ever truly retaliate against them?
Yeah.
But then, you know, in what way could you possibly go the extra mile for them? And bless them. And I think it's like, perhaps, again, this might be like an overextension of the principle at what Jesus is getting at here, but like perhaps it's just genuinely not getting upset about it. Like perhaps that's, you know, an attitude of the kingdom of God in that moment where it's like, you know what, like it's a parking spot, and, you know, I was waiting for it, but they took it, and now they have it, and I can choose to hold on to my anger and, in a sense, like harbor that to retaliate against them, and like just dwell on the reality that was not fair. They should not have parked in my spot, or that was not fair. They merged so late, and I patiently waited in this like long line of cars.
Okay. I have to step in though and justify the zipper concept.
Zipper merge?
Yes, because so many people are uninformed. So when they use the zipper lane and then they merge when the lane runs out, that's actually what it's intended for.
Oh yeah.
So
absolutely.
I just don't want people to feel like they can't zipper merge around here.
Oh no, zipper, and I'm not even. This has become a traffic podcast, but I'm not even talking about the zipper lane, because I understand especially zipper merging, but like when you see that the lane is ending, everyone has already gotten over. And then you come flying past, like the lane has already ended, and you're on the shoulder, and you're like, I'm gonna get ahead
that's
of
a different
2
ballgame.
cars.
We're talking about illegal behavior
Exactly.
in that example.
Well, and just impatient behavior, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that, people do get upset, when other people are trying to merge at the last minute in a lane where their car is allowed to drive in. I mean, like,
so separate from the zipper thing. Right.
No,
I mean, you should encourage people to be doing that.
Yeah. All that being said,
release the zipper.
I would just say, like, those are, if we're trying to get more nitty gritty in like the practical ways where, we would want to practice this sort of, I think, a spirit of generosity, of forgiveness, of love toward others is, those small incursions, I think if we hold on to them, can really do damage to our own kind of ongoing souls, our dispositions toward other people. And perhaps when we find ourselves in those situations, figuring out ways to be like, like, even if we were waiting there and the other car pulled up, like, what would it look like just to be like, I don't know that person, but it might bless that person just to take that spot. So I'm just going to give it to them. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like a little trite given the nature of the subject, but perhaps these are little smaller ways that we can practice to build up the desire. Because I think when we do that, I think we'll find in our hearts like this, like, oh my goodness, like what joy is there in being generous? Because I think a spirit of retaliation oftentimes comes from this, mentality where, like, we just think there's not going to be enough for me. And so I'm living in the scarcity mindset. And so I have to retaliate in order to ensure that I get what's mine.
And I think people are, in the last couple of years, just done. They're full to the brim of seeing injustice or what they perceive to be injustice. And it would take just one little straw that broke the camel's back for them to go like just ballistic over a parking place at Costco, because it's like that just represents all the injustice that they've been carrying and they don't know what to do with it. And so they become like undone over these apples or that parking place or whatever. So I think we're working with a really traumatized society. And so some of these examples that we're giving seem small, but even in the course of a day, it could be like all that a person could muster to like give grace over apples or parking places or zipper lanes or whatever. It's just people are so tapped out, I think. So all the more reason to be adding in grace back into our culture, patience, love, etc. I think that all the more it's countercultural.
Yeah, and I think that like we run into a lot of, we're not super confrontational as a culture, at least where we're at right here, right now. Because I think what I do when someone cuts me off or takes a parking spot is it's just like a good minute and a half of just silent judgment while I'm trying to find a new parking spot, or like I'm sitting behind a car going 55 on the freeway. I'm just like, I wonder what stickers they have on the back of their car. I'm gonna really look at this.
Better not be an Arbor sticker.
Yeah, I'm gonna pass them and look in their window and be like, makes sense, which like is not a good. It's not a good thing to do, right? And I think that it kind of leads you to a spot of then just assuming the worst in society, and you're like, this is what people do. This is. Which I don't think is I don't think that's a Christ-like behavior. I think that like Jesus did have the best intentions and perspective on creation and people, right? And I think that like that retaliation, which doesn't feel very conflict-oriented, the judgment, I think that like ultimately that doesn't lead to anything beneficial or anything Christ-like of just like, what are you going to do? People are going to be people. And it's like, or people could be good, right? And what's going on in their day, right? And do they need that parking spot? Like we brought up with the parking spot.
I thought of the ultimate traffic non-retaliation response, which is when someone begins to tailgate you.
Yeah.
I think the classic retaliatory response is to brake check them.
Yep.
You guys ever brake check someone before?
I would never do that.
I've never done it, but I've wanted to, yeah.
I grew up driving in Southern California.
Yeah.
We don't do that because people might escalate it even further.
Sure. Yeah, I've never done it either.
But
you've
read about it.
I've read about it. That's why I bring it up.
Yeah.
And perhaps it's just, the kind thing to, they wanted the shirt, right? They wanted, and you just give them the whole road, right? You move off to the side and you let them fly by.
Yep. All right. Well, we've talked about our modern examples of it.
Very automobile centric.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Relatable.
Do you guys think that, I mean, obviously, one of the things about us going through the Sermon on the Mount is we're taking chunks of it, right? But do you think that retaliation, that chunk of the sermon, do you think that was something that was chewed on for a while by the listeners after they left this? I also imagine they had a lot that they were probably chewing on, and like, man, he said a lot of stuff up there for a while. But you had kind of talked about how it was a little bit of not revolutionary, but it was a big mind change for these people who had been under this way of, this is how justice looks, you know? This is done to you, you go do it, right? Do you think this was something that was very just mind-altering for the listeners of this message?
I mean, I think so, for sure. Because even though it wasn't seemingly explicit, I mean, Jesus always taught, I don't know, mildly cryptically at times. You had this nation that was, being oppressed again for what, like the fourth time, right? Or I mean, like, here they are again in their own land, but oppressed under this Roman rule. And they had this longing and this desire to see the kingdom come. And I'm sure that in their imaginations about it, they thought, you know how it's going to come? These oppressors are going to get theirs. And so they thought, their future hope was like the retaliation is coming. And certainly that bleeds into the way you live everyday life. And here Jesus is saying, yeah, well, if one of those oppressors comes and approaches you and asks you to go a mile, what if you went 2? Like that in and of itself. And then think about the larger scope that, like, in the whole narrative of like the story of redemption, that those people that they were so frustrated with would be so intimately grafted into their family in just a few short years. Like the people who they thought were enemies were going to be the ones who were like, no, that's actually your brother. That's your sister,
Wow. Do you think that people at Arbor walked away yesterday kind of mind altered like the listeners back when they were listening to Jesus about this section?
I would say yes. I'm speaking on behalf of Arbor now.
Yeah.
So I know the hearts and minds of all of them.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
No, again, I think the last couple of years have been so hard, and people have set up coping mechanisms in themselves for survival in a way in the last couple of years. And I feel like a call to like put down your arms, like surrender to like a higher way, love and patience and non-retribution, non-cancel culture, like I'm leaving because of this and I'm going to harp on everybody's littlest mistakes and I'm not going to let anyone get by with anything. Like that just feels even countercultural in our neck of the woods. And so I feel like it just gave us all so much to think about. And again, I don't think it took people very long to think of like, name a conflict in your mind or somebody who you've been in conflict with recently and how this would play out. The thing I was thinking about in terms of different Enneagram types as they would receive this information and where you left room for the Enneagram 8s in this, like they're after justice, right? And they want to pursue justice, and it is a good thing and it is a right thing. And so they look at an infraction not so much as to like grace it and let it go or peacemake over it or through it. They're looking to like enact some justice, and so that our world is safe and the way it should be. So you left room for them to still act because you said, we're not asking that you would be abused and continue to endure abuse by someone or to let injustice,
pervade and keep going on. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you left room for the Enneagram 8 to still be the justice keeper. because I think that is something that people had to turn over in their mind. Like, if I'm going to not retaliate, like, where is the line between retaliation and justice? You know, because penalty for sin or wrong behavior, is that retaliation? You know, I think people had to sift through that.
Yeah, and I don't think that even, obviously we had the ideas of what Jesus isn't saying, in this call to non-retaliation. But I also don't think that speaking truth to a situation is retaliation. So I think we also have to take, the entirety of Jesus' teaching and synthesize that and apply it collectively. And so in a non-retaliatory spirit, what does peacemaking look like? And so like one area I wish I could have elaborated more on was, I used that pretty simple example of, you have the Roman soldier asks you to go the mile, you go the extra mile. What if your boss brings a bunch of extra work to you, and instead of, quiet quitting or not doing it, you did the work, you went above and beyond. But I could also easily imagine a situation there where, like, you don't want to retaliate. You don't want to not do the work. You don't want to talk about how terrible your boss is to your other coworkers. But, like, when does peacemaking come in? Like, when is it a misuse or a manipulation or a misappropriation of their authority? And you need to have like a frank conversation with your boss and be like, hey, I want to be here. I want to work here.
Yeah. To be clear, I can't do it all on the 11th hour of the work week.
Yeah. And also I've noticed this pattern. And listen, as my boss, I'm sure what you want from me is you want the best out of me. And listen, I want to give my best to this. I don't know, maybe you hate your job, but like, even still, like you want to do the work well. And then that's when I think that peacemaking conversation comes in, and it's like, well, here's maybe a better way where this work can be assigned, And so in that sense, the reason why I wish I could have elaborated on it was not so that like the way forward is to always just do the work and keep your mouth shut,
right?
And
doormat, you had said that doormat.
Again, like we're not called to be doormats. I don't think the way of non-retaliation is the way of the doormat. Although I do think at times it's going like we're going to incur like suffering and quote unquote violence as followers of Jesus in this world specifically, right? Because the way of this world, I think, is so antithetical to the way of Jesus.
Yeah. Well, I think that like the key to that is thinking through like, is the reason I want to retaliate, the reason that I want to bring this up or bring this conflict to light, is it a pride thing? Like, was I wronged and I shouldn't be wronged and that's not fair to me? Is it a truth thing? Like, because I think that's a very good cipher to look through on. Like, okay, is this wrong? Is this going to hurt other people down the road if I don't do anything about it? Or do I feel personally slighted?
Mm-hmm.
And can I be humble and incur that in hopes that a conversation will come up after the fact, right? Because I don't think that swallowing your pride and being humble turns you into a doormat unless it's just like that's what you've resigned your life to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
I will always just take it on the chin and move forward,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, and that's what I like about this conversation is it is countercultural to, no, like you should hang on to your pride as an American, as a Westerner, as a citizen of the world, right? Like you should take pride in yourself and you shouldn't let anyone walk all over you or do these things to you. And I don't think that's the way of Jesus, right? I think that truth and peace are most important. And sometimes following Jesus is a little bit of swallowing your pride and being humble in these circumstances. So
yeah, absolutely.
So, all right. Well, we're getting close to the 30-minute mark. Is there anything else that you guys want to ask or talk about before we close things out?
I was just going to give an example of good non-retaliation. Last week, we were in our team meeting working together on Wednesday, and I clicked a magic button that erased months of your work.
I have protected your identity for like a week and a half
now,
and now you're just going to blow it. Okay.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
So what was awesome was that in the moment, you were super full of grace to my face when that happened. But one thing that was cool for me was to hear later from Ryan that you had handled it, you had communicated it to somebody else in a really grace-filled way too. When I wasn't listening and I wasn't present.
Oh.
So I heard through the grapevine that you also handled this situation with so much grace.
This was while I was reprimanding her for it.
Oh, sick. Okay.
Well, I had the retaliation coming another way.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to point that out because I think people who think like that we are about the Lord's work full time, might not encounter occasions for feeling like either put upon or that something wrong has gone on in our world, and that Hayden, you had a choice for retaliation. You could have like gossiped about me, you could have slandered, or just also erased all of my work, or something. So anyhow, I felt really blessed by that, and that encouraged me. It built trust for us working together more. So anyhow, I just wanted to thank you.
Oh, no problem.
And it's like we practice these things.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So just wanted to point that out.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, you heard it here first, Arbor. Alison erased it, but everything's okay.
Everything was my fault. I'm so sorry.
Yes.
I'll never do it again.
It's all good.
All right. Well, is there anything else before we close things out?
No, I think we covered it. I think that this is one of those things, and we were talking about this earlier in our team meeting, where by the grace of Jesus' Spirit in our lives, we're able to press forward and do this. But if you heard this past week's message and you feel this sense of like heaviness or that, man, that's so daunting, how am I going to do it? Listen, that's all of us stepping into this calling. It's not easy, and it oftentimes feels deeply counterintuitive, or sometimes it'll feel deeply unfair. But I'd process it in groups. Prayerfully bring the conflicts that you face to other people who love Jesus to process those things and how to move forward in those conflicts that you're facing.
Well, Ryan, thank you for putting in the work and sharing the message with us. And we will see you guys next week.
All right. See you guys.